She arrived in Silverton, Colorado, with 11 cents in her pocket, a bruise on her face, and the name of a man who was supposed to marry her. But when she found him, he looked her dead in the eyes and said, "I did not write that letter. No husband, no money, no way home." Clara Morgan was stranded in a mining town full of secrets, and the most dangerous man in it had already learned her name. Frank Deacon knew what really happened on that staircase back in Missouri. He knew about the husband who never hit the bottom step alive, and now he was using that secret like a loaded gun pointed straight at her head. But Clara wasn't the only one hiding something. The quiet rancher who turned her away, he was drowning in a guilt so deep he hadn't touched another person in 3 years. And the richest man in town, he was dying, with a confession that would burn Silverton to the ground. Before this story ends, Clara will be dragged to a frozen river with a knife at her throat, and the only thing standing between her and death is a choice she made on a staircase in the dark. You're listening to Wild West Stories Channel, where the frontier is unforgiving, love is hard-won, and every soul carries a scar worth telling. If rugged Western romance and untamed frontier tales set your heart on fire, saddle up. You found your home. This story teaches us that survival isn't always clean, and healing isn't always pretty. But the bravest thing you'll ever do is stop running and choose to stay. If this story grabbed you by the heart, smash that like button. Leave a comment with the moment that hit you hardest. Share it with a friend who loves a great Western tale. And subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. Now, let the story begin.
"Throw that woman in the river." The words split the darkness like a gunshot. Clara Morgan heard them through a haze of pain and cold, her wrists bound with rope that bit into her skin every time the man dragging her took another step. The frozen ground tore at her dress and shredded the skin on her knees, and the sound of rushing water grew louder with every yard they covered. Torchlight danced across the rocks. 2 men hauled her forward while a third walked ahead, his boots crunching on frost. She knew that walk. She knew those boots. Frank Deacon moved with the easy confidence of a man who had done terrible things before and expected no consequences. Clara twisted her neck and looked down at the Animas River. Black as a grave, swollen with snowmelt, roaring down from the high peaks of the San Juan Mountains. The water churned over rocks with a sound like bones grinding, and the spray that hit her face was so cold it burned. 2 months ago, she thought. 2 months ago, I stepped off a stagecoach in this town with 11 cents in my pocket and a bruise on my face, looking for a husband. Tonight, I am going to die because I found something far more dangerous than a husband. I found the truth. Deacon stopped at the river's edge and turned to face her. The torchlight caught his eyes, and what she saw there was worse than hatred. It was nothing. No feeling at all. Like looking into the eyes of something that had never been human in the first place. The 2 men lifted her to her feet. The river roared below. 2 weeks earlier. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the Wells Fargo office in Silverton, Colorado territory, and Clara Morgan pressed a torn piece of petticoat against the bruise on her left cheekbone. The powder she had applied that morning was long gone, sweated off, and rubbed away by 8 days of hard travel, and now the bruise announced itself to anyone who cared to look, purple fading to green at the edges. The color of a storm cloud, the color of shame. Her hands would not stop shaking. She told herself it was the cold. October in the mountains, and the air that came through the coach door when the driver opened it had teeth. She stepped down into mud that sucked at her boots and stood there for a moment, taking stock. The main street of Silverton stretched before her, rough timber buildings lining both sides, smoke rising from chimneys, men in work clothes moving along the boardwalks with the purposeful stride of people who had somewhere to be. A mining town. She had learned that much from the other passengers. Silver had been found in these mountains, and men had rushed here like ants to sugar. Clara did not wait for someone to find her. She had spent 4 years waiting for things to happen to her, and every single one of those things had been bad. She picked up her carpet bag, the one that held everything she owned in this world, and walked into the Wells Fargo office. A clerk with spectacles and ink-stained fingers looked up from his ledger. "I am looking for a man named Nathaniel Grayson," Clara said. "I was told he would meet me here." The clerk blinked. "Grayson? The rancher?" "Yes. He did not say anything about meeting nobody." The clerk looked her over, taking in the worn traveling dress, the cheap bag, the bruise. "You might try the Silver Strike Saloon. He takes a whiskey there most afternoons when he comes to town." Clara thanked him and walked back out into the cold. She found the saloon 3 buildings down, pushed through the swinging doors, and stepped into a room that smelled of tobacco smoke and spilled beer and the sour undertone of men who worked hard and bathed seldom. Every head turned. A woman walking into a saloon in the middle of the afternoon was not a common sight in Silverton, and certainly not a woman alone carrying a carpet bag with a bruise on her face that told a story nobody wanted to hear. Clara scanned the room. She did not know what Nathaniel Grayson looked like. The letter had not included a description. But she was looking for a man who owned a horse ranch, and her eyes settled on a figure at the far end of the bar who looked like he belonged on one. Tall, broad shoulders, dark hair touched with silver at the temples, hands wrapped around a whiskey glass with the careful grip of someone holding something he did not particularly want. Before she could speak, a man near the door let out a low whistle. "Well, now, looks like Nate Grayson has got himself a lady caller." Laughter rippled through the room. The tall man at the bar did not laugh. His head came up slowly, and his eyes found Clara across the smoky room, and something moved across his face that she could not read. Not anger, not amusement. Something closer to pain. He set down his glass and walked toward her. The crowd parted. He was taller than she had guessed, maybe 6 feet or a shade over, and he moved with the economy of a man who had learned not to waste motion. His face was weathered, lined around the eyes, and those eyes were the color of a winter sky, gray and hard and giving nothing away. He stopped in front of her. "Miss Morgan." It was not a question. "Mr. Grayson," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I received your letter." Something shifted in those gray eyes. He looked past her at the watching crowd, then took her elbow, gentle but firm, and steered her toward the door. Outside, he guided her to the side of the building, where the noise of the saloon faded, and they stood in the shadow of the eaves with their breath misting in the cold air. "I did not write that letter," he said. The words hit Clara like a fist. She felt the strength drain from her legs, felt the ground tilt under her feet the way it had tilted the night Thomas fell. She gripped her carpet bag with both hands and held on. "I do not understand," she whispered. Nathaniel looked at her, really looked. His eyes moved from the bruise on her face to her white-knuckled grip on the bag, to the worn seams of her traveling dress. And Clara saw something in his expression that she had not expected. Not pity, recognition. "I did not write that letter," he said again, "but I know who did, and I know why." Then he turned and walked away. His boots echoed on the boardwalk, steady and unhurried. And Clara stood alone in the shadow of the Silver Strike Saloon with 11 cents in her purse and no idea what to do next. She watched him go. And she noticed something strange. When he had said, "I know why," his voice had not been angry. It had been grieving. As if the reason behind that letter was something so painful he could not bring himself to say it out loud. Clara stood in the shadow of the saloon for a full minute after Nathaniel Grayson disappeared around the corner. Then she picked up her carpet bag and started walking. She did not cry. She had used up her tears somewhere between Missouri and the Kansas border, and what was left inside her now was something harder than grief. Something with edges. 4 years married to Thomas Morgan had taught her many things, and the most important was this: when the ground drops out from under you, do not look down. Just keep moving. She walked the main street of Silverton with her eyes open and her mind working. This was the skill that living with a violent man had burned into her bones. Read the room. Identify the threats. Locate the exits. Thomas had been predictable in his unpredictability, and Clara had survived by learning to see danger before it arrived, the way a rabbit learned to smell a fox upwind. She noted the general store, the barber shop, the assay office. She noted which men on the boardwalk looked at her with curiosity, and which looked at her with something hungrier. She noted the boarding house with its hand-painted sign and calculated the cost of a room against her 11 cents, and came up short by a considerable distance. She was halfway down the street when a man stepped off the boardwalk and into her path. "Afternoon, ma'am." He was young, maybe 30, with a lean build and a clean-shaven face that might have been handsome if not for the eyes. The eyes were wrong. They were the pale blue of a frozen pond. And they moved over Clara with a kind of patient calculation that made her skin crawl. Frank Deacon was his name, though she did not learn it until later. He tipped his hat. He held the door of the hotel open for her. He called her ma'am in a voice as smooth as oiled leather and offered to buy her a cup of tea in the dining room. Clara recognized him immediately. This was the most dangerous kind of man. The kind who gift-wrapped cruelty in good manners. Thomas had started exactly the same way, charming during courtship, attentive and kind. The fist had not come until the day after the wedding, but the man who would throw that fist had been there all along, hiding behind a smile. "That is very kind of you," Clara said, "but I am looking for work, not tea." She stepped around him and kept walking. She felt his eyes on her back all the way down the street, and she did not look back. At the end of the main street, she spotted a narrow building with steam rising from the back. A sign above the door read, "Dawson Laundry," in bold black letters. White sheets hung on lines in the yard, snapping in the mountain wind. A woman appeared in the doorway. She was perhaps 58, with iron-gray hair pulled back tight, and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same rock as the mountains. She had the kind of eyes that measured everything they looked at and found most of it wanting. "Help you," the woman said. It was not exactly a question and not exactly an invitation. "I'm looking for work," Clara said. "I can sew, I can mend. My father was a tailor for the Union Army. He taught me his trade." The woman studied her. Her gaze moved from Clara's face to her hands, to the carpet bag, and back to her face. And she did not bother to hide the assessment. "You are the one from the stagecoach. The one Grayson turned away." Clara lifted her chin. "I am." The woman disappeared inside and came back a moment later holding a shirt with a 6-inch tear along the seam. She thrust it at Clara. "Fix it." Clara sat down on the porch step, took her sewing kit from her bag, threaded a needle, and went to work. Her father had insisted on perfection. He had made her unpick her stitches and start over 100 times until she could sew a seam that would hold under battlefield conditions. Those lessons paid off now. Her stitches were small and even, reinforced at the stress points, nearly invisible from the outside. She handed the shirt back. The woman examined it in silence, turning the fabric, testing the seam with her fingers. Her expression did not change, but something shifted in her eyes. "Who taught you to sew like that?" "My father. He made uniforms for Union soldiers, and sometimes he stitched up the men who wore them." The woman nodded once. "I am Martha Dawson. My husband is dead 5 years. I run this laundry alone. The work is hard and the pay is thin, but I will give you a place to sleep and food to eat if you can keep stitching like that. 1-week trial. After that, we talk about wages." It was not generous. It was barely enough. But it was more than Clara had, and it was infinitely better than standing in the street with 11 cents and nowhere to go. "I accept," Clara said. "Thank you." Martha looked at her with an expression that was almost but not quite a smile. "There are 2 kinds of people in this town," she said. "People running from something and people hunting something. Which one are you?" Clara did not answer. But she thought about it long after Martha showed her to the back room where she would sleep, a space barely large enough for a narrow cot and a wooden crate that served as a table. She thought about it while she unpacked her small bag and hung her spare dress on a nail in the wall and arranged her sewing kit on the crate the way her father had taught her. She thought about it while she propped the fading daguerreotype of her parents against the wall and stared at their faces in the lamplight. "Which one are you, Clara?" maybe both. That evening, Nathaniel Grayson rode out to the finest house in Silverton. Victor Langford's home sat on a hill above the town like a king surveying his domain. 2 stories, whitewashed timber, glass windows that had been freighted in from Denver at considerable expense. The house of a man who wanted everyone to know he had money. Nathaniel tied his horse and walked up the porch steps without knocking. Victor was in the parlor, sitting in an armchair by the fire, a blanket across his knees despite the warmth of the room. He looked up when Nathaniel entered, and something crossed his face. Guilt. Maybe relief. "Nate," he said, "I wondered when you would come." Nathaniel did not sit down. He stood in the middle of Victor's parlor with his hat in his hands and his jaw set hard as granite. "You wrote that letter," he said. "You used my name. You brought a woman all the way from Missouri on a lie." "I did." "Why?" Victor was quiet for a moment. Then he coughed, a deep, wet sound that seemed to come from somewhere far down in his chest. He reached for a handkerchief and pressed it to his mouth, and when he pulled it away, Nathaniel saw the red stain on the white cloth. Victor tried to hide it. He was not fast enough. "I am dying, Nate." Victor's voice was calm, almost gentle. "Consumption. The doctor in Denver gave me 6 months, maybe less. I did not want to leave this world knowing you were still rotting alone on that ranch." Nathaniel felt the anger drain out of him and something worse rush in to fill the space. He had known Victor Langford for 15 years. Victor had stood beside him at his wedding. Victor had held him up at Anna's funeral when his legs would not work and the world had gone dark. They had been brothers in everything but blood. And now his brother was dying. "That does not give you the right," Nathaniel said, but his voice had lost its edge. "No, it does not." Victor looked at the fire. "But I am running out of time to do right by the people I care about, and you were always at the top of that list." Nathaniel put his hat on and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. "She had a bruise on her face, Victor. Somebody hit her. Somebody hit her hard enough to leave a mark that has not faded in over a week." Victor said nothing. "You brought her here with a promise that was a lie. Whatever happens to her now is on you." He left, rode back toward his ranch with the night coming on fast and the cold settling into his bones. He should have gone straight home. He should have poured himself a whiskey and sat by his own fire and not thought about anything at all. But as he passed through town, he saw the light burning in the laundry window, and through the glass he saw Clara Morgan sitting at a table, sewing by lamplight. Her head was bent over her work, her needle moving with quick practiced strokes, and she did not know he was there. Nathaniel stopped his horse. He sat in the saddle in the dark street and watched her through the window, and he hated himself for watching. He hated that he noticed the way the lamplight caught her hair. He hated that he noticed the way she bit her lower lip when she concentrated. He hated that he noticed anything at all about this woman he had no right to notice. He turned his horse toward home and rode into the darkness. But the image stayed with him. Clara Morgan, sewing by lamplight, alone in a strange town, with 11 cents and a bruise, and the kind of stubborn dignity that reminded him of someone he had loved and lost and could not forget. 3 days passed. Clara learned the rhythm of Martha Dawson's laundry the way a soldier learns the rhythm of a march, through repetition and necessity, and the knowledge that stopping was not an option. She rose before dawn each morning and dressed in the unheated back room, her breath misting in the dark. By the time she emerged, Martha was already working, her hands deep in a tub of soapy water, scrubbing at shirts and trousers that the miners of Silverton had beaten half to death against rock and ore in their own hard living. The work was brutal. Great tubs of water heated over fires. Harsh lye soap that turned Clara's hands red and raw within the first hour. A mangle for wringing out heavy, wet fabric that made her arms ache from shoulder to wrist. But the mending was where Clara shone, and Martha knew it. By the second day, Martha had turned over the entire mending operation to Clara. The basket was always full. Torn trousers with 6-inch rips along the inseam. Shirts missing buttons. coats with seams that had given up entirely under the punishment of a 12-hour shift underground. Clara worked through them with steady hands in her father's training, her needle flashing in and out of fabric, her stitches small and strong and nearly invisible. They did not talk much during the work. Martha was not a talker. But the silence between them was not hostile. It was the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other without needing to explain. Martha left a plate of hot food for Clara each evening without comment. Clara patched a leak in the roof on the second day without being asked. These were not favors. They were the language of women who had learned that actions meant more than words, because words could lie, and actions could not. On the third night, everything changed. They had finished the day's work and eaten supper, salt pork and beans, and the sourdough bread that Martha baked in a cast-iron Dutch oven. The stove was ticking as it cooled, and the wind had picked up outside, whistling through the gaps in the walls and carrying the smell of coming snow down from the peaks. Martha was sitting on her stool, mending a sock by lamplight when she spoke. "My husband Elijah," she said. "He worked in the Langford mine. Good worker, strong. The foreman accused him of stealing tools one time, called him a thief in front of the whole crew. It was not true, but that did not matter. The foreman beat him for it. Not bad enough to break anything, just bad enough to make a point." She paused. Her needle kept moving, steady and rhythmic. "Elijah came home that night and tried to act like nothing happened, but I could see him wince when he sat down. I could see the bruises through his shirt when he reached for something on the shelf, and I could not do a single thing about it. I just watched. Night after night I watched him hurt, and I could not fix it." Martha looked up from her sock and met Clara's eyes across the small room. The lamplight threw shadows across her face, deepening the lines around her mouth and eyes, and Clara saw something there that she recognized. The particular exhaustion of a woman who had spent years being powerless and had never quite recovered from it. Martha did not ask about the bruise on Clara's face. She did not have to. She had told her own story and left a space, and now it was Clara's choice whether to fill it. Clara set down her sewing. Her hands were trembling, and she pressed them flat against her knees to still them. "Thomas did not fall down the stairs," she said. The words came out quiet, barely a whisper, but in the small room with the stove ticking and the wind outside, they sounded enormous. "He came home drunk. That was not unusual. He came home drunk most nights toward the end. But that night was worse. He had lost money at cards, and someone had said something to him about his wife, about how thin I was getting, about the bruise on my jaw from the week before. It shamed him, not because he had done it, but because someone had noticed." Clara's voice was steady, but her eyes were far away, looking at something Martha could not see. "He found me on the second-floor landing. I was coming out of the bedroom with an armful of laundry. He did not say a word. He just put his hands around my throat and squeezed." She touched her neck. An unconscious gesture. The ghost of a memory burned into muscle and bone. My vision started going black. I could hear this sound, this rushing in my ears like a river. And I thought, this is it. This is how I die. In a hallway that smells like whiskey and dirty laundry, with a man's hands around my throat who promised before God to love and protect me. She stopped, took a breath. But my hands. She looked down at them, at the calluses, and the needle pricks and the red roughness from the lye soap. My hands found his chest, and they pushed. The stove ticked. One push. That is all it was. He was drunk and off balance, and his feet went out from under him, and he fell backward down the stairs. I heard his neck break before he hit the bottom. It sounded like a green branch snapping. Silence filled the room. Outside, the wind moaned through the eaves. "I do not know if I killed him or if I saved myself," Clara said. "The line between those two things is so thin I cannot see it. I have not slept a full night since that night. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that sound, that snap. And I do not know if I am a woman who defended her own life or a murderer. Martha set down her sock. She looked at Clara for a long time, and her face was neither pitying nor judging. It was the face of a woman who understood that the world was not made of simple categories, that sometimes survival and sin wore the same clothes and walked the same road. "You lived," Martha said. "That is enough. You do not have to name it anything else." Clara felt something loosen in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, not absolution, but permission. Permission to carry this weight without letting it crush her. Permission to be a woman with blood on her hands, who was also a woman who deserved to keep breathing. They did not speak of it again that night. Martha banked the stove and blew out the lamp, and Clara went to her narrow cot in the back room and lay down in the darkness. She did not sleep. But for the first time since Missouri, the sound in her head was not the snap of Thomas's neck. It was the sound of Martha Dawson saying, "You lived." And the word carried a weight and a mercy that Clara had not known she needed until she heard it. 5 miles outside Silverton, in a ranch house that sat alone at the base of a ridge, Nathaniel Grayson was not sleeping either. He lay on his back in the bed he had shared with Anna, staring at the ceiling where the shadows of branches moved in the moonlight like fingers reaching for something they could not grasp. The house was silent except for the wind and the occasional stamp of a horse in the barn. He had not changed anything in this room since Anna died. Her hairbrush still sat on the dresser. Her shawl still hung on the hook by the door. The cradle he had built with his own hands still stood in the corner, empty, the blanket she had knitted folded neatly inside, waiting for a baby who would never come. 3 years. 3 years since the night that split his life into before and after. The memory came the way it always came, uninvited and relentless. Anna's face, pale as candle wax, her eyes wide with pain and fear. The midwife, old Mrs. Henderson, working with hands that shook too much and knew too little. The blood. God, the blood. It had soaked through the sheets and dripped onto the floor, and Nathaniel had knelt in it while he held his wife's hand and felt her grip weaken one finger at a time. She had begged him to ride to the next town for a real doctor, begged him with what was left of her voice. But the blizzard was howling outside, and the passes were buried in snow, and Nathaniel had made a calculation. If he left, he might not make it back in time. If he stayed, the midwife might be enough. The midwife was not enough. Anna died at 4:17 in the morning with her hand in his and her blood on his skin, and the last word she spoke was his name. Nate. Just that. Nate. And then nothing. The baby, their daughter, never drew a single breath. Nathaniel had buried them together on the ridge above the ranch, in a spot where the wildflowers bloomed in spring and you could see the mountains in every direction. He had carved the headstone himself because no one else would do it right. Anna Grace Grayson and daughter, beloved. He had not carved his own crime into the stone, but he carried it everywhere. He had let his wife die because he was afraid. Afraid of the blizzard, afraid of the distance, afraid of leaving her alone. And his fear had killed her as surely as if he had put a gun to her head. That was why he could not let Clara Morgan into his life. Not because he did not feel something when he looked at her. He felt it. He felt it like a wound reopening. The bruise on her face, the way she held her head up even when everything inside her must have been screaming to break down. The posture, spine straight, chin lifted, eyes terrified but refusing to look away, exactly like Anna. But Nathaniel Grayson had already proven that he could not protect the people he loved. He had held his wife while she bled to death and done nothing. Nothing. And he would not put himself in a position to fail like that again. He would not be responsible for another person. He would not risk another death on his conscience. He got up, walked to the window, looked out toward the distant glow of Silverton's lights. The laundry would be dark by now. Clara would be asleep. Or maybe not. Maybe she was lying awake in her own narrow bed, staring at her own ceiling, carrying her own ghosts. He stood at the window for a long time, and he thought about a woman with a bruise on her face and a way of holding a needle that said she had been taught by someone who loved her very much, and he was angry. Not at Clara. at himself. Because 3 years of grief had built walls around his heart high enough to block out the sun. And somehow, in 3 days, a woman he barely knew had found a crack in those walls, and that terrified him more than any blizzard ever had. Clara was alone in the laundry when Frank Deacon came back. It was mid-morning, 5 days after her arrival in Silverton. Martha had gone out to deliver a bundle of clean shirts to the mining office and would not be back for an hour. Clara was working on a particularly difficult mending job, a canvas coat that had been nearly ripped in half by a rockfall, when the door opened and Deacon walked in, as casual as a man entering his own kitchen. He had not changed since their first meeting on the boardwalk. Same lean build, same pale eyes, same oiled leather voice. He was dressed better than most men in Silverton. Good boots, a shirt that had been tailored, not bought off a shelf. He smelled of tobacco and something sharper beneath it, like the tang of metal on a cold day. "Morning, Miss Morgan," he said. He removed his hat and hung it on the hook by the door, as if he had done it 100 times before. "Mind if I sit?" It was not a question. He pulled out the stool that Martha used for sorting laundry and sat down across the counter from Clara, settling himself with the relaxed ease of a man who was accustomed to taking whatever space he wanted. Clara did not stop sewing. She kept her eyes on her work and her voice neutral. "Mrs. Dawson is not here. She will be back in an hour if you have laundry to drop off." "Oh, I am not here about laundry." Deacon leaned back on the stool and crossed his arms over his chest. "I am here to talk to you. I am working, I can see that." He watched her sew for a moment, and something in his expression shifted, almost admiring. "You are good at that. Real good. Where did you learn?" "My father. Army man, was he?" Deacon did not wait for confirmation. "I heard Union tailor, stitched up soldiers in the field. Must have been hard, growing up around all that blood." Clara said nothing. Her needle moved in and out of the canvas with mechanical precision, but her heart had begun to beat faster. There was something wrong about this conversation. Deacon was leading somewhere, and she could feel the trap being set even if she could not see its shape. "You know," Deacon said, leaning forward slightly, "I make it my business to know things about the people who come to Silverton, especially people who arrive under interesting circumstances. A mail-order bride whose groom says he never wrote the letter. That is interesting. That is the kind of thing a man like me pays attention to. I am sure you have better things to do with your time, Mr. Deacon." "Maybe. Maybe not." He smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "See, I also heard some things about your life back in Missouri. Heard you were married to a man named Thomas Morgan. Heard he died in what they called an accident. Fell down the stairs of a boarding house, broke his neck." Clara's hands went still on the canvas. "Funny thing about stairs," Deacon continued. His voice was still pleasant, still conversational, still wrapped in silk paper. "A big, strong man like Thomas Morgan, done in by a staircase. Folks die from the smallest things, do they not? A misstep, a shove. Hard to tell the difference once a body is at the bottom." He let the words hang in the air between them. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Her fingers tightened on the needle until the point drove into her thumb, and the small, bright pain was almost welcome because it gave her something to focus on besides the fear that had locked her chest tight as a drum. Did Deacon know what had really happened on those stairs? Or was he guessing, fishing in dark water with a baited hook, waiting to see what he could drag to the surface? His face gave nothing away. The pale eyes watched her the way a cat watches a mouse hole. Patient, certain. Clara forced herself to breathe. She picked up her needle and began sewing again, and when she spoke, her voice was as steady as she could make it. "My husband died in an accident, Mr. Deacon. That is what the coroner ruled, and that is what happened. Is there something else I can help you with?" Deacon studied her for another long moment. Then he stood, picked his hat off the hook, and walked to the door. He paused with one hand on the frame and looked back at her over his shoulder. "I like you, Miss Morgan. You are not like the mice in this town. You have got fire, but fire burns both directions. Remember that." He put on his hat and left. The door closed behind him, and the room felt twice as large without him in it. Clara sat perfectly still for 30 seconds, then set down her sewing because her hands were shaking too badly to hold the needle. He knew. Maybe not the details, but he knew something was wrong about Thomas's death, and he was keeping that knowledge in his pocket like a loaded derringer, ready to pull it out whenever he needed leverage. Clara pressed her hands flat against the counter and breathed. In and out, in and out. The way she had learned to breathe after Thomas hit her, slow and deliberate, calming the animal panic that wanted to take over her body and send her running. She would not run. She had been running her entire adult life. Running from Thomas, running from Missouri, running from the sound of a neck snapping in a dark hallway. She was done running, but she was also afraid, and being done with running did not make the fear go away. It just meant she would have to stand inside the fear and keep breathing. That afternoon at his ranch 5 miles outside town, Nathaniel Grayson was driving fence posts with a sledgehammer when Tommy Hayes came tearing up the road on a mule that was moving considerably faster than any mule had a right to move. "Mr. Grayson, Mr. Grayson," the boy shouted, pulling up the mule in a spray of mud that splattered Nathaniel's boots. You will never guess what happened. Nathaniel drove the post one more time, sinking it deep into the ground. "I am not in the habit of guessing, Tommy. Spit it out." Tommy Hayes was 10 years old, freckled, perpetually dirty, and possessed of the kind of boundless energy that exhausted everyone around him. He was also, Nathaniel had noticed, considerably smarter than most adults gave him credit for. The boy could read and write better than half the miners in Silverton, and he had a memory that held on to details the way a trap held on to a coyote. "That man Deacon went to see Miss Clara at the laundry today," Tommy said, sliding off the mule. "He went in when Mrs. Dawson was out and stayed for a good while. I saw him through the window." Nathaniel stopped swinging the sledgehammer. "You were spying. I was not spying. I was delivering Ma's mending, and the door was shut, so I looked through the window to see if anybody was inside, and there was Mr. Deacon sitting right there talking to Miss Clara, and she looked scared, Mr. Grayson, real scared. Not crying scared, more like rabbit with a hawk circling scared. You know what I mean." Nathaniel set the sledgehammer down. He said nothing for a moment, but his hand was wrapped around the handle so tight the tendons stood out across the back of his knuckles like bridge cables. "You did right telling me, Tommy," he said. "Now get on home before your mother worries. Are you going to do something about it?" "I am going to finish this fence." But Tommy was already riding away, and Nathaniel did not finish the fence. He stared at the half-driven post for a long minute, then walked to the barn and saddled his horse. The excuse he gave himself was thin as paper. He was just checking on a newcomer, making sure she was settled. It was what any decent person would do, especially after the way Victor's letter had brought her here under false pretenses. It had nothing to do with the image of Clara sewing by lamplight that had taken up residence in his mind and would not leave. Nothing to do with the way her chin lifted when she was afraid, as if courage was something she had to physically hold up. Nothing at all to do with that. He rode into town and tied his horse outside the laundry and knocked on the door, and when Clara opened it, he saw that her eyes were red-rimmed. She had been crying, not the weeping kind. The silent kind that left marks but made no sound. The kind you learned when making noise brought worse things than tears. Something cracked open inside Nathaniel's chest, something he had spent 3 years sealing shut with work and whiskey, and the deliberate cultivation of numbness. He felt it give way, and the sensation was so startling that he almost stepped back off the porch. "Miss Morgan," he said, "I wanted to see if you were getting on all right." Clara looked at him. She did not seem surprised to see him, but she did not seem pleased either. She seemed tired, tired in the way that goes beyond sleep, the kind of tired that settles into your bones and makes the world look gray around the edges. "I am fine," she said. "Would you like to come in?" "Actually," he said, and he did not know where the words came from because he certainly had not planned them. "I was wondering if you know how to shoot. I know the basics. My father taught me. The basics will not stop Frank Deacon if he decides to do more than talk." Nathaniel heard himself speaking and wondered when he had decided to say any of this. "You need to be able to defend yourself. If you will allow me, I would like to make sure you can." They went around to the back of the laundry where a line of fence posts made decent targets. Nathaniel handed her his pistol, a Colt that had been with him since the war, and stood behind her to adjust her stance. His hands moved over hers to position them on the grip. His chest was close enough to her back that he could feel the warmth of her body through her dress. The smell of lye soap and something else, something cleaner and sweeter underneath, came off her skin and hit him like a punch to the gut. Clara's hands were steady on the gun. She did not flinch or giggle or go soft the way some women did around firearms. She settled into the stance with the quiet competence of someone who had done this before. And Nathaniel felt his hands tighten on hers without meaning to. "Breathe," he said. "Exhale slow. Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it." She fired. The bullet punched into the fence post dead center. She fired again, same spot. 3 more rounds, and by the end she had a grouping tight enough to cover with a playing card. Nathaniel stepped back. His hands felt empty without hers in them, and the absence was loud. "Your father teach you that too." Clara looked at him, and something passed between them that neither one could have named. "My father taught me a lot of things proper young ladies are not supposed to know." And then Nathaniel almost smiled. It was not much, just the corner of his mouth twitching upward for a heartbeat before discipline pulled it back down. But Clara saw it. She caught it the way you catch a firefly in a jar, quick and careful, and she held it. "You are full of surprises, Miss Morgan," Nathaniel said. "You have no idea, Mr. Grayson. He left after that, walked to his horse and mounted up, and rode away, without looking back." But Clara stood in the yard behind the laundry and watched him go, and she was thinking about his hands on hers, warm and rough with callus, and impossibly gentle, as if he were holding something fragile, something he was afraid of breaking. That night on her narrow cot, for the first time since Missouri, Clara did not think about Thomas or the stairs. She thought about Nathaniel Grayson's hands and the way they had steadied hers on the gun. And she thought about the almost smile that had crossed his weathered face like sun breaking through clouds. And she thought, this is the most dangerous thing I've ever encountered. More dangerous than Thomas. More dangerous than Deacon. Because this time, I want to stay. The stagecoach from Denver was hit 3 days later, 2 miles north of town at Canyon Ridge, where the road narrowed between rock walls, and a driver had nowhere to run. 3 men in bandanas. They took the strongbox and shot the driver in the shoulder and disappeared into the mountains before the dust settled. Sheriff Hayes organized a posse the same afternoon. Nathaniel volunteered. He told himself it was civic duty, nothing more. The kind of thing any man worth his boots would do. It had nothing to do with the fact that the robbery had happened on the same road Clara had traveled 2 weeks earlier, and the thought of her in that coach when the bullets started flying made his stomach clench like a fist. They rode out at noon. 8 men on horseback, armed and grim, following tracks that led north into high country. Nathaniel rode near the back of the group where he could observe without being observed, and what he observed troubled him. Sheriff Hayes led them with too much certainty. There was no hesitation at forks in the trail, no stopping to study tracks, no discussion about which direction to go. Hayes rode like a man following a map he had memorized in advance, and that did not sit right with Nathaniel at all. They found the robbers in a line shack 20 miles north of town. 3 men sitting around a cold fire with the empty strongbox open at their feet. No lookout posted. No attempt to cover their tracks. When Hayes called for their surrender, they gave up without a fight, put their hands in the air and walked out into the snow, and let themselves be bound as meek as lambs. Nathaniel watched this with the trained eye of a man who had spent 4 years scouting for the Union Army, reading enemy movements the way most people read a newspaper. Something was wrong. Men who would shoot a stage driver did not fold this easy, and one detail clinched it. The youngest of the 3 prisoners was wearing boots with the Langford Mining Company brand stamped into the leather, the kind of boots issued only to mine employees, not something a drifting outlaw would be wearing. These men were not highway robbers. They were mine workers playing a part, and they had been caught too easily because they were meant to be caught. Nathaniel said nothing. He filed it away alongside a growing collection of things that did not add up, and he watched Sheriff Hayes play the hero all the way back to town, and he kept his mouth shut. But on the return ride, he made a detour. Victor Langford kept a hunting cabin in the high country above Canyon Ridge. Nathaniel had been there a dozen times in the old days, back when he and Victor used to hunt elk in the autumn and drink whiskey by the fire and talk about their plans for the future. Back before Anna died and the future became a word that Nathaniel avoided the way a man avoids a rattlesnake den, the cabin was empty, but Nathaniel found things there that made his blood run cold. Bottles of laudanum lined up on the shelf like soldiers. A letter from a physician in Denver confirming a diagnosis of late-stage consumption and recommending increasing doses of opium for the pain. And in the drawer of the small writing desk, a document that changed everything. It was a draft of a last will and testament, Victor Langford's will, leaving the entirety of his estate, the mine, the house, the land, the bank accounts, everything, to a single beneficiary identified only by initials. F.D. Frank Deacon. Nathaniel sat at Victor's desk with the will in his hands, and the pieces began to arrange themselves in his mind. Victor was dying. Victor was leaving everything to Deacon. The mine had been the center of staged robberies for months, and the men doing the robbing were mine employees. He did not have the complete picture yet, but the edges were coming into focus, and the picture they were forming was ugly enough to kill for. He put the will back in the drawer exactly as he had found it, left the cabin exactly as he had entered it, and rode back to Silverton with the last light dying behind the mountains, and a knot in his gut that had nothing to do with the cold. While Nathaniel was riding through the mountains, Clara and Martha were building something that looked a lot like trust. 3 days alone together, while the men chased robbers. Martha taught Clara how to make proper sourdough, the only bread that would rise right at this altitude. You use a longer ferment, she explained, hands deep in dough, her movements practiced and precise. The yeast works slower up here. You have to be patient with it. Clara taught Martha a reinforced stitch for canvas that her father had developed for patching artillery tarpaulins. Twice as strong as a standard stitch, took half the time. Martha examined the technique with her usual critical eye and pronounced it acceptable, which for Martha was practically a standing ovation. In the evenings they talked. Martha told Clara about Elijah. Not just the death, the life. He sang while he washed dishes, Martha said, stirring the beans on the stove. Terrible voice, could not carry a tune in a bucket. But he sang every night, and the house felt alive with it. He planted wildflowers in front of the laundry because he said a business ought to have something beautiful about it, even if the work inside was ugly. He spoke English with an accent that made the miners smile, and he never let them see that their smiling hurt him because he knew they were laughing at how he sounded, not laughing with him. Martha paused and her voice grew tight. They took more than my husband when that mine collapsed. They took the man who made this town bearable. They took the singing out of my house. And Victor Langford took the land he is buried on, seized it for unpaid debts that did not exist because he knew I had no lawyer and no money and no one willing to stand up for a widow. She wiped her eyes roughly with the back of her hand. That land is all I want. I do not care about the money or the mine or any of it. I just want to visit my husband's grave without having to ask Victor Langford's permission to step on what should be my own ground. That night, Martha showed Clara the ledgers. They waited until full dark, until the street outside was quiet, except for the distant noise from the saloons. Martha knelt beside the stove and pried up a stone from the floor, revealing a hollow space beneath. From that space, she pulled a bundle wrapped in oilskin. "These are what got my husband killed," she said quietly, unwrapping the bundle to reveal a stack of papers covered in neat columns of numbers and dates. Elijah was good with figures. The mine foreman knew it, so he had Elijah keep backup books, secondary records in case the main ledgers were damaged. Clara took the papers carefully and held them toward the lamplight. Even at a glance, she could see the discrepancies. Columns that did not match. Totals that had been altered, weights of silver ore that shrank mysteriously between the mine and the assay office. "This shows systematic theft," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thousands of dollars." Elijah calculated 40,000 over 3 years, maybe more. Martha's hands were clenched in her lap. "He was going to take these papers to the territorial governor's office in Denver. He told me the night before he died," said Langford could not silence everyone. She stopped, drew a breath that shuddered. The next morning there was a cave-in. They brought his body out in pieces. Clara looked up from the papers. There was one more document in the pile that made everything else pale in comparison. A letter in Victor Langford's own handwriting ordering the mine foreman to replace the structural timbers in the lower shafts with cheaper wood. Not a memo. Not a second-hand account. Langford's own hand, his own words, his own signature at the bottom. "This is direct evidence," Clara said. "This connects Langford to the conditions that caused the collapse." "I know." Martha's face was hard as the mountains outside. "But I was too afraid to use it. A widow against the richest man in the territory. Who would believe me? Who would care?" Clara refolded the papers carefully and placed them back in the oilskin. "I care," she said, "and I think I know someone else who will." That night, Clara went to sleep thinking about ledgers and lies and the web of corruption that seemed to touch everything in Silverton. She was awakened by a sound at the door. Not a knock. Something softer. She rose and padded across the cold floor and opened the door. On the threshold lay a single wild columbine, Colorado's state flower, its blue and white petals impossibly delicate against the rough wood of the doorstep. It should not have been blooming this late in the season. It was either the last flower of autumn or a small miracle, and either way someone had gone to considerable trouble to find it. There was nobody in sight. But in the fresh snow that had fallen during the night, boot prints led away from the door and down the alley toward the main street. Clara looked at those prints, and she recognized them. She had seen those boots 2 days ago, standing behind her in the yard while she learned to shoot. She had felt those boots shift in the dirt, when their owner leaned close enough for her to feel his breath on her neck. Nathaniel Grayson had left her a flower in the snow. Clara picked it up. The petals were cold against her fingers, and she held it carefully, the way you hold something that might disappear if you grip too hard. She went back inside and put it in a tin cup of water on the crate beside her bed, and she fell asleep looking at it, and she smiled. For the first time since Missouri, she fell asleep smiling. Nathaniel rode back into Silverton the next afternoon with trouble sitting on his shoulders like a vulture. He had spent 3 days in the mountains turning the evidence over in his mind, the boots on the fake robber, the will leaving everything to F.D., the laudanum bottles in Victor's cabin, and every time he arranged the pieces, the picture got uglier. But that was not what drove him straight to the laundry without stopping at his ranch first. He told himself it was because Martha and Clara needed to know about the staged robberies. He told himself it was because the evidence in the ledgers might connect to what he had found in Victor's cabin. He told himself a lot of things while his horse carried him through the streets of Silverton, and none of them were the real reason. The real reason was that for 3 days in the mountains, he had not been able to stop thinking about Clara Morgan, and the realization had settled over him like a fever he could not break. He tied his horse outside the laundry and went in. Clara was alone. Martha had taken a basket of mending to deliver to the mining office. The laundry was quiet except for the tick of the stove and the whisper of fabric as Clara worked her needle through a miner's torn shirt. She looked up when he came in, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Clara said, "You look terrible. I have been sleeping on frozen ground for 3 days. You also look like a man who has something to say and does not know how to start." Nathaniel closed the door behind him. He pulled out Martha's stool and sat down across the counter from her, and he told her about the robbery, about the mine company boots, about the posse that found the robbers too easily, about Victor's cabin, the laudanum, the doctor's letter, the will. Clara listened without interrupting. When he finished, she set down her sewing and told him about the ledgers, about $40,000 in stolen silver, about Elijah Dawson's death and the letter in Victor's handwriting ordering cheap timber, about the backup records that a dead man had kept and his widow had hidden for 5 years. They sat across from each other in the small room while the picture assembled itself between them. And it was a picture of corruption so thorough and so deep that it touched everything in Silverton. The mine, the sheriff, the staged robberies, the deaths, all of it radiating out from Victor Langford like cracks from a stone thrown through glass. "If the will leaves everything to F.D., Clara said, and F.D. is Frank Deacon, then Deacon stands to inherit a fortune built on theft and murder. Does he know? I do not think so." Nathaniel shook his head slowly. "At least not yet. But Victor is dying. He does not have much time. Sooner or later, Deacon will find out, and when he does, there is no telling what a man like that will do with that kind of power. We need to get this evidence to someone who is not in Langford's pocket," Clara said. "The territorial governor, federal marshals. The territorial governor's office is in Denver. That is a week's ride in good weather, longer with the passes closing for winter. And we cannot trust anyone in this town to deliver it. Hayes is bought and paid for. Then we find another way." Clara's mind was working. Her eyes had that sharp focus that came over her when she was solving a problem, the same focus Nathaniel had seen when she was sewing. Her entire being narrowed to the point of the needle. She leaned forward to point at a line in the ledger, her finger tracing across the page. "Look at this entry. The dates correspond to the robbery reports. Every time silver went missing from the mine, a stagecoach was robbed within the week. The robberies are cover for the theft. Langford steals the silver, stages a robbery to explain the loss, and the real silver goes somewhere else entirely." Nathaniel leaned in to look where she was pointing. The movement brought his face close to hers. Very close. Close enough that he could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes and the darker flecks in her brown irises, and the small scar on her jaw where something sharp had cut her once. Close enough that he could smell the lye soap on her hands, and something underneath it that was neither soap nor sweat, but something uniquely her. They both stopped. The ledger forgotten. The evidence forgotten. Everything forgotten, except the few inches of charged air between them. Clara heard him breathing. It was not steady anymore. It was the breathing of a man fighting something he did not want to feel, and losing. Nathaniel could see the pulse beating in Clara's throat. Fast. Faster than it should be for a woman sitting still in a quiet room. He pulled back, stood up so fast the stool scraped against the floor. "I cannot do this," he said. Clara looked up at him. "Do what? This. Whatever is happening here. Nothing is happening. That is exactly the problem." His voice was raw, scraped clean of every defense he had spent 3 years building. "Because if I do not stop right now, something will happen, and I do not know how to live with that. I do not know how to let someone in when the last person I let in died in my arms because I was too much of a coward to ride for help in a snowstorm." The words hung in the air. Nathaniel looked as stunned as Clara felt. He had not meant to say that. It had come out the way a bullet comes out of a gun, driven by a pressure that had been building too long. Clara did not speak. She stood up slowly, reached across the counter and placed her hand flat against his chest. Right over his heart. She felt it hammering under her palm, hard and fast, the heartbeat of a terrified man. She did not pull him closer. She did not push him away. She just stood there with her hand on his heart and let him feel that she was real and present and alive and not going anywhere. Nathaniel closed his eyes. The muscles in his jaw worked. And for the first time in 3 years, the face behind his eyelids was not Anna's. The moment shattered like a window breaking. Because a window did break. A rock the size of a man's fist came crashing through the front glass of the laundry, spraying shards across the floor and the counter and Clara's sleeve. Nathaniel had her behind him before the last piece of glass hit the ground, his body between her and the broken window, his hand on the pistol at his hip. Nothing moved outside. The street was empty, but tied around the rock with a strip of rawhide was a scrap of paper with one word written on it in crude block letters. Tonight. Nathaniel looked at the paper, looked at Clara, and everything that had been happening between them, the almost touch, the almost words, the almost everything, was buried under the immediate reality that someone had just made a threat and meant it. "It is Deacon," Clara said. She was pale, but her voice was steady. "He threatened Martha before, told her the laundry might have an accident. A fire, a broken window. We need to get Martha. We need to get her back here now." But they were too late. The fire started at sundown. Someone had doused the outer walls of the laundry with kerosene while the town was busy with supper, and by the time the first flames were visible, the building was already burning on 3 sides. Martha was inside. Clara saw the smoke first. She was walking back from the general store where she had gone to buy salt, and the orange glow in the sky stopped her dead in her tracks. For one terrible second she could not move. Then she ran. Nathaniel was already there. He had been riding back from his ranch when he smelled the smoke, and he reached the laundry at a dead gallop, throwing himself off his horse before the animal had fully stopped. The front wall was a sheet of flame. The back door was blocked by burning debris. And from inside, barely audible over the roar of the fire, Martha Dawson was screaming. Nathaniel did not hesitate. He pulled his coat over his head and went through the front door at a run, into the heat and the smoke and the sound of timber cracking overhead. Clara stood in the street and watched. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. The roof groaned. A section of wall collapsed inward, sending a geyser of sparks into the darkening sky. People were gathering now, buckets being passed hand to hand from the water trough, but it was clear the building was lost. Where was Nathaniel? 40 seconds, 50. Clara started toward the door, and then he was there, bursting through the flame like something out of a nightmare, his coat smoking, his eyebrows singed, Martha Dawson in his arms. He carried her clear of the building and laid her on the ground, and Clara was there instantly, kneeling beside them. Martha was conscious, but her hands were burned raw. The skin was blistered and weeping, and when the doctor arrived minutes later, his face told Clara everything she needed to know. Martha would not be using her hands for weeks, maybe longer. The laundry, everything Martha had built since Elijah's death, was gone, reduced to char and ash and smoking timbers in the time it took to eat supper. Later, after the doctor had wrapped Martha's hands and given her laudanum for the pain, after the crowd had dispersed and the embers had cooled enough to approach, Clara went back to the ruins and searched. She was not looking for the ledgers. She knew they were gone. Whoever had set the fire had done it deliberately, and they would have made sure to find and destroy the evidence that Martha had hidden under the floor. But they had not been thorough enough. In the ashes near the front door, Clara found a handkerchief. It was badly scorched but not destroyed, and the monogram embroidered in the corner was still legible. 2 letters, stitched in silk thread that had survived the heat. V.L. Victor Langford. Deacon had used his employer's handkerchief to wipe kerosene from his hands before striking the match. A small mistake, a careless moment. And it had left behind a piece of evidence that connected Victor Langford's personal property to the arson that had destroyed Martha Dawson's life. Clara tucked the handkerchief into her coat pocket and walked back to where Nathaniel was waiting with the horses. His face was grim in the moonlight, and his clothes still smelled of smoke. She held up the handkerchief. He read the monogram, and something in his gray eyes went hard and cold as the mountain peaks above them. "We end this," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "We end this." Nathaniel left before dawn. He told Clara and Martha, who was resting at the boarding house with her hands wrapped in bandages and her face gray with pain, that he was going hunting. Which was true, in a manner of speaking. He was going to Canyon Ridge to hunt for proof. He rode north into the high country on his bay gelding, moving the way the Union Army had taught him to move through hostile territory. Slow, silent, alert to every sound and shadow. He stayed off the main trails, picking paths through scrub pine and over rocky ground where hoofprints would not show. And he reached the ridge above the old mining camp just as the first gray light of dawn began to eat away at the darkness. The camp spread out below him in a shallow valley. Most of the buildings had collapsed long ago, their roofs caved in, their walls sagging like drunken men. But 3 structures near the center were intact, maintained. Smoke rose from one chimney, and in front of the largest building sat 4 strong boxes bearing the Wells Fargo insignia. Nathaniel lay flat on the ridge and studied the camp through his spyglass. 2 guards. They moved in a lazy circuit around the maintained buildings, rifles slung over their shoulders with the casual grip of men who did not expect trouble. Inside the largest building, through a window that had been cleaned recently enough to see through, Nathaniel could make out wooden crates stacked against the far wall. Even from this distance, he could see the dull gleam of silver. He waited. Patience was not a skill he had been born with. It was a skill the war had beaten into him, one cold night at a time. He waited until both guards went inside the main building, probably for coffee, and then he moved. Down the ridge, across the open ground between the tree line and the first building. He used every fold in the terrain, every shadow, every rock large enough to break his silhouette. It took him 40 minutes to cover a distance he could have walked in 5, and when he reached the strong boxes, his heart was hammering, but his hands were steady. The serial numbers were stamped into the metal. He pulled out a small notebook and copied them down with quick, precise strokes. Then he moved to the window and looked through. The crates were open, silver bars stacked inside, each one stamped with the Langford Mining Company mark. And on a table near the door, a shipping ledger. The door was ajar, the guards' voices coming from a back room, and Nathaniel made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed in the army. He went inside. He had 30 seconds, maybe less. He opened the ledger and scanned the pages with the speed of a man who had spent 4 years reading captured enemy documents by candlelight. Dates, quantities, destinations, and on every page a signature authorizing the shipment. Frank Deacon, not Langford. Deacon. Which meant either Deacon was running the operation himself, or Langford had given him enough authority to sign for stolen silver. Either way, it was a rope around both their necks. Nathaniel memorized what he could, closed the ledger, and got out. He was back on the ridge 10 minutes later with his heart pounding and his notebook tucked inside his coat, and the guards never knew he had been there. He rode back toward Silverton in no particular hurry. The evidence was solid. Serial numbers that would match the robbery reports. A shipping ledger signed by Deacon. Combined with Martha's ledgers, even the copies she had made, it was enough to bring in territorial authorities and break Langford's operation wide open. But the satisfaction of a job well done was short-lived, because what happened that evening in Victor Langford's house changed everything. Frank Deacon was summoned to Victor's study at 8 o'clock. He went because Victor paid him well, and because saying no to Victor Langford was not something people in Silverton did. He found the old man sitting by the fire, thinner than the last time, the bones of his face showing through skin that had gone the color of old wax. Victor Langford was dying visibly now, the consumption eating him from the inside like fire eating through timber. "Sit down, Frank," Victor said. Deacon sat. He watched Victor reach into the desk drawer with hands that trembled and pull out a sealed envelope. Heavy paper. Expensive. The kind used for legal documents. "This is my will," Victor said. "I have been putting it off for too long, and my time is running short. I want you to have this." Deacon took the envelope, opened it, read the document inside with the slow care of a man who had learned to read late and never quite trusted words on paper. Then he stopped, read one passage again, looked up at Victor with an expression that Deacon himself would not have recognized if he had seen it in a mirror. "It says, 'My son,'" Deacon said. His voice was flat, empty, a house with the furniture removed. Victor nodded slowly. It was the nod of a man who had been carrying a weight for 30 years and was finally setting it down. "Your mother's name was Lily," Victor said. "She worked at the Golden Spike Saloon in Abilene. She was beautiful and kind, and I was young and foolish, and I got her with child, and then I left, because I had a reputation to build and a fortune to make, and a girl from a saloon did not fit into those plans." He paused, coughed. The handkerchief came away red. She died of fever when you were 3. I had you placed in St. Catherine's Home for Boys in Kansas City. I told myself it was the right thing, that you would have a better life. But the truth is, I was a coward. I was afraid of what people would say, afraid of the scandal. So I left my own flesh and blood in an orphanage and pretended he did not exist. Deacon sat perfectly still. His face was a mask. But behind the mask, something was happening. Something tectonic. The foundations of his entire life were shifting. And the structure built on top of those foundations, the cruelty, the violence, the dead certainty that he was alone in the world and always would be, was beginning to crack. I tracked you, Victor continued, from a distance. When you were old enough, I brought you here, gave you work, trained you, shaped you into someone who could take over when I was gone. But I never called you son, not once in 30 years. And that was the worst thing I have ever done. Worse than the stealing. Worse than looking the other way when Elijah Dawson died. Worse than any of it. He reached out a thin hand toward Deacon. I am sorry, Frank. I know it is too late, and I know sorry is not enough. But it is all I have left to give. Deacon looked at the hand, at the old man in the chair, at the will in his lap that called him son in ink, when his father had never called him son in life. For 30 years, Frank Deacon had been kicked from one place to the next, raised on fists and hunger, and the absolute bone-deep certainty that nobody in this world wanted him. He had learned early that kindness was a trap, and love was a word people used to get things from you, and the only person you could trust was yourself. He had built his life on that foundation, and it had made him hard and cruel and efficient and empty. And now he learned that the emptiness had not been necessary. That there had been a father all along. A father who had watched from a distance while his son grew up mean and hurt and alone. Who had the power to change everything with a single word, and chose silence instead. Because of reputation, because of scandal, because the opinion of strangers mattered more than the life of his own child. Deacon did not weep. He did not shout. He folded the will carefully and put it back in the envelope, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet and perfectly controlled. Too late, old man. He stood, walked to the door, turned back once. You could have changed everything, he said. One word, father. That is all it would have taken. One word, 30 years ago, and I would have been different. I would have been whole. But you chose your reputation and you made me into what I am. So do not sit there and tell me you are sorry. You are not sorry for what you did. You are sorry that you are dying and there is nobody left who gives a damn. He walked out into the night, mounted his horse, sat in the saddle for a long time while the cold bit into his skin and the stars burned overhead with the indifference of things that would outlast every human sorrow ever felt. Then he made his decision. He would not wait for Victor to die and leave him a fortune built on blood. He would take what he was owed on his own terms. He would complete the final silver shipment, the big one, the one sitting in crates at Canyon Ridge. He would load it onto wagons and move it out of the territory and disappear. Victor could die in his big house with his guilt for a blanket. Silverton could rot. But first he had to deal with the witnesses, Martha Dawson and her hidden ledgers, the clerk Peters who knew too much about the books, and Clara Morgan, especially Clara Morgan, the woman who had been asking questions, the woman Grayson was protecting, the woman who, if she lived, would bring everything crashing down. Deacon rode to the shack where his 2 most trusted men slept off their whiskey. He kicked the door open and stood in the frame with the torchlight behind him. Find the Morgan woman, he said. Bring her to the Animus River crossing. Tonight we finish this. Clara knew something was wrong the moment she stepped into the alley behind the boarding house. It was too quiet. Silverton at night was never truly quiet. There was always noise from the saloons, the bark of dogs, the distant clang of the mine works running their night shift. But the alley behind the boarding house was silent in a way that felt deliberate, arranged, like a room that had been cleared before someone important arrived. She had been visiting Martha, sitting beside the older woman's bed, holding a cup of water to her lips because Martha's bandaged hands could not grip, reading to her from a newspaper someone had left at the desk. Martha had fallen asleep mid-sentence, the laudanum pulling her down into a merciful darkness, and Clara had tucked the blanket around her shoulders and slipped out. That was when they grabbed her. Two men, big, fast. They came out of the shadows on either side of the alley like wolves flanking a deer, and before Clara could scream, a hand clamped over her mouth, and an arm wrapped around her middle and lifted her off the ground. Clara fought. She did not think about it. The instinct was older than thought, older than fear, burned into her by 4 years of Thomas Morgan and 27 years of being a woman in a world that treated women like property. She bit the hand over her mouth hard enough to taste blood. She kicked backward and connected with a shin, and she drove the sewing needle she always kept tucked in her sleeve into the forearm of the man holding her. He howled and dropped her. She hit the ground rolling, scrambled to her feet and ran. But the second man was faster. He caught her by the hair, yanked her backward, and slammed her against the wall of the building hard enough to drive the breath from her lungs. Then rope, around her wrists, tight. The kind of knot that a man who worked with horses tied without thinking. They dragged her. Through the back alleys, away from the boarding house, away from the main street where someone might see. Clara's knees scraped against frozen ground and her dress tore and the rope bit into her wrists with every step. And she kept her eyes open and her mind working because that was what survivors did. They kept thinking even when thinking seemed useless. She knew where they were taking her before they got there. She could hear the river, the Animas, swollen with snow melt from the high peaks, running fast and cold and deadly. In October, the water temperature was barely above freezing. A person thrown in would have maybe 3 minutes before the cold shut down their muscles, maybe 5 before the heart stopped, maybe less. They reached the crossing. It was a flat stretch of riverbank where the water ran wide and shallow before dropping into a canyon downstream. Torchlight flickered, and standing at the water's edge, with the orange light dancing across his face, was Frank Deacon. He looked different. The veneer of civilization that he had worn like a tailored suit was gone. His eyes were wild, the pale blue gone dark with something that was not quite anger and not quite madness, but some terrible combination of both. He was a man who had learned the worst possible truth about himself 12 hours ago and had decided to burn the world down in response. "Bring her here," Deacon said. The two men dragged Clara to the riverbank and dropped her on her knees in the frozen mud. The water roared beside her, close enough to spray her face, cold enough to steal her breath. "Throw that woman in the river." Clara heard the words and felt the fear hit her like a wall of ice water. This was real. This was not Thomas drunk on the landing. This was not a fist she could survive. This was the end. But then, something inside her, the thing that had pushed Thomas down the stairs, the thing that had gotten her onto a stagecoach with 11 cents and ridden 8 days into the unknown, the thing that had looked at Martha Dawson and seen a friend instead of a stranger. That thing refused to die on its knees. Clara looked up at Frank Deacon, and she did not beg. She said, "Victor Langford is your father, and he did not even have the decency to claim you." Deacon's face went blank. The torchlight made his skin look yellow. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Clara pressed harder. She was guessing. She was taking the initials FD from the will that Nathaniel had told her about and the timing of Deacon's sudden escalation, and the way Victor had always kept Deacon close, and she was throwing it all at the wall to see what stuck. "You have killed men for a dying old man who watched you grow up in an orphanage and did nothing," Clara said. Her voice was stronger than she felt. "Every terrible thing you have done in this town, you did for a father who never loved you enough to say your name." Deacon stared at her. His hand, which had been moving toward the knife at his belt, had stopped. His breathing had changed, and in his eyes Clara saw something she had not expected. Pain. Real pain. The kind that a man cannot fake because it comes from too deep and too far back. "How do you know that?" he whispered. Before Clara could answer, the sound of hoofbeats split the night. Nathaniel Grayson had arrived at the boarding house 7 minutes after Clara left it, and found Martha Dawson awake and panicking. "She left 20 minutes ago," Martha said, her bandaged hands clutching the blanket. "She should have been back by now. Something is wrong. I can feel it." Nathaniel did not waste time on horses. He ran. Through the back door of the boarding house into the alley, moving fast and low. His eyes adjusted to the dark within seconds, the old scout training kicking in like a reflex, and he read the signs the way he had once read enemy positions. Scuff marks in the frost, a piece of torn fabric snagged on a nail, and on the frozen ground, catching the moonlight, a sewing needle, smeared with blood. Clara's needle. He followed the trail at a run. When the trail left the alleys and headed toward the river, he doubled back for his horse and rode. He came out of the darkness at a gallop, the bay gelding's hooves throwing up mud and gravel, and what he saw in the torchlight nearly stopped his heart. Clara on her knees, Deacon standing over her, 2 men with guns, the river roaring. But he was not alone. Tommy Hayes, 10 years old and brave beyond any reasonable measure, had been out past his bedtime when he heard the commotion in the alley. He had run not to his father's office, but to his father's house, and he had pounded on the door until Sheriff Jim Hayes opened it with sleep in his eyes and a question on his lips. "Pa," Tommy had said, breathing hard, "they took Miss Clara to the river. Mr. Deacon and his men. They are going to kill her. You have to come. You have to do the right thing." And Sheriff Hayes, who had spent 5 years selling his conscience to Victor Langford in exchange for medicine for his dying wife, who had looked the other way so many times he had almost forgotten which way was forward, looked at his son standing there in the cold night with terror on his face and courage in his eyes, and something that had been dead inside him for a very long time stirred and opened its eyes. He grabbed his gun belt. He grabbed 3 men from the houses on either side. And he rode. They arrived 30 seconds after Nathaniel. 4 men on horseback, armed and angry, coming out of the darkness like the cavalry in a dime novel. Sheriff Hayes' voice cut through the noise of the river. "Frank Deacon. Step away from that woman." Deacon's men looked at each other, looked at the guns, dropped their weapons and put their hands up. They were hired muscle, not true believers, and the arrival of the law was all the reason they needed to quit, but Deacon did not quit, did not. The revelation about his father had broken something inside him, snapped the last tether holding him to reason, and what was left was a man with nothing to lose and a knife in his hand. He grabbed Clara by the hair and hauled her to her feet, pressing the blade against her throat. "Nobody move!" Deacon shouted. His voice was ragged, torn. "I will cut her throat and throw her in the river and ride out of here, and you will never see me again. That is how this ends. That is the only way this ends." Nathaniel had his rifle up. The barrel was steady. His eye was on the sight. But Deacon was behind Clara, using her as a shield, and the torchlight made shadows that shifted and lied, and the angle was wrong. If he fired and missed by an inch, Clara would die. Clara felt the blade cold against her skin. She felt Deacon's hand shaking in her hair. And she felt the fear, enormous and absolute. But underneath it, she felt something else. The same thing she had felt on the stairs in Missouri. The same thing she had felt when she stepped off the stagecoach with 11 cents. The refusal to die without a fight. Her father had taught her many things. He had taught her to sew and to shoot and to ride and to stitch wounds on men who were screaming. And he had taught her one more thing, the last thing on a winter evening in their kitchen in Missouri, when she was 14 years old, and the war was ending, and he was teaching her how to survive in a world that was not kind to women. "If a man grabs you from behind," her father had said, "do not struggle up. Go down, dead weight. The fastest way to break a grip is to become heavier than the person holding you expects." Clara went limp. Every muscle in her body released at once, and her full weight dropped straight down. The sudden collapse pulled the knife away from her throat as Deacon's hand, still gripping her hair, could not hold both her weight and the blade. She hit the ground and rolled sideways out of his reach, and in the same instant she heard the crack of a rifle. Nathaniel's bullet took Deacon in the right shoulder. The knife flew from his hand. He staggered sideways, grabbed at his arm, and went down on one knee. Sheriff Hayes was on him before he could rise. Two men held Deacon down while Hayes bound his wrists with rope, and it was over. Clara lay on the frozen ground by the river and stared up at the stars. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered, and the cold was biting through her torn dress, and the place on her throat where the knife had pressed stung where the blade had just barely broken skin. Then Nathaniel was there, kneeling beside her, his hands on her shoulders, lifting her, pulling her against his chest. His arms wrapped around her, and for the first time since she had known him, there was no distance, no pulling back, no wall between them. She felt his heart hammering against her cheek, felt his breath ragged in her hair, felt his arms tighten around her as if he was afraid she might dissolve like smoke if he let go. "Do not ever," he said, his voice cracked like timber in a fire. "Do not ever scare me like that again." Clara pressed her face against his chest and breathed him in, leather and hoarse and cold night air and the sharp undertone of fear. And underneath all of it, the steady beat of a heart that had been frozen for 3 years and was breaking open. "I am here," she said. "I am right here." The morning after the river came quiet and cold. Deacon was locked in the town jail with his shoulder bandaged and his mouth shut. He sat on the cot in his cell and stared at the wall and said nothing to anyone. The two men who had dragged Clara to the river talked freely, eager to trade information for leniency. They confirmed everything: the staged robberies, the silver at Canyon Ridge, Deacon's role in the arson at the laundry, all of it spilling out like water from a cracked dam. Sheriff Hayes took their statements and wrote them down in a hand that shook only slightly. When he was done, he looked at the pages and then he looked at his own badge, and the weight of 5 years of compromise settled on his face like a shadow. Tommy watched his father from the doorway of the office. "You did the right thing, Pa." Hayes looked at his son. "I did the right thing once. That does not make up for all the times I did the wrong thing." "It is a start," Tommy said. And Tommy was right, the way children often are when adults have made things too complicated to see clearly. Nathaniel rode out to Victor Langford's house alone. He did not bring the sheriff. He did not bring a posse. He did not bring his rifle. He went the way old friends go when there is something terrible between them that needs to be spoken out loud before it can be put to rest. Victor was in his armchair. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside, his skin hanging on his bones, his eyes sunk deep in their sockets. The fire was burning, but Victor was wrapped in a blanket and still shivering. The consumption was winning, and both men knew it. "It is over," Nate said. "I know." Nathaniel sat down across from him. The chair creaked, the fire popped. Somewhere in the house, a clock was ticking, measuring out the small amount of time Victor Langford had left. "I need to understand," Nathaniel said. "All of it, from the beginning." Victor told him. He told it the way a man tells a story when he knows it is the last story he will ever tell. Plainly, without excuse. The mine had been failing. 7 years ago, the richest vein played out, and the replacement shafts were producing half of what they should have been, and Victor was looking at bankruptcy. He had 200 men on his payroll and their families depending on those wages, and the banks in Denver were calling in their loans. So he started skimming, just a little at first. Enough to cover the gap between what the mine produced and what the books said it produced. He sold the extra silver through back channels and used the money to keep the mine running, to make payroll, to keep 200 families fed. It was supposed to be temporary, Victor said, just until the new vein came in. But the new vein did not come in, and the skimming became a system, and the system became an empire. And somewhere along the way, I stopped being a man trying to save his workers, and became a man stealing from everyone, including himself. "And Elijah Dawson," Nathaniel said. Victor's face crumbled. Elijah found the discrepancies. He was too smart and too honest, and he was going to take his evidence to the territorial governor. I told the foreman to scare him. That is all. Just scare him into keeping quiet. The foreman decided on his own that scaring was not enough. Victor's hands were shaking. The handkerchief in his lap was spotted with red. I found out afterward. The foreman told me what he had done, told me the cave-in was deliberate, that he had pulled the support timbers himself. And I did nothing. I did not report it. I did not fire him. I did not go to Martha Dawson and tell her the truth. I just looked the other way and told myself there was nothing I could have done. That is what cowards tell themselves, Nathaniel said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a man who knew exactly what cowardice felt like, because he had tasted it himself on the worst night of his life. We tell ourselves there was nothing we could have done because the truth, that we chose to do nothing, is too ugly to live with. Victor looked at him, and for a moment the dying man and the grieving man recognized each other. Two men who had failed when it mattered most and were living with the consequences. "And Deacon," Nathaniel said, "your son. The worst of all of it." Victor's voice broke. "Lily was beautiful. She was kind. She deserved better than me, and so did the boy. But I was building something, or I thought I was, and a saloon girl's bastard did not fit the picture. So I put him in an orphanage and told myself he would be better off. 30 years, Nate. 30 years that boy grew up thinking nobody wanted him. And the whole time his father was right here, close enough to touch. Too much of a coward to reach out." Nathaniel stood up. He looked at this man who had been his closest friend, who had stood beside him at his wedding and held him up at his wife's funeral, and he felt the complicated grief of watching someone you love become someone you do not recognize. "I am taking the evidence to the territorial governor's office in Denver," Nathaniel said. "You will face charges, but I will tell them you cooperated. I will tell them you came clean on your own." Victor nodded. "I will not live to see a courtroom, maybe not. But you will die as a man who told the truth." Victor reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a document. Not the will, something else. A deed of land. "This is the plot where Elijah Dawson is buried," Victor said. "I seized it from Martha after Elijah died because I was afraid she would find something on the property that connected me to the cave-in. There was nothing to find. I was just afraid. I am signing it back to her. It is the only right thing I have left to do." Nathaniel took the deed, folded it, put it in his coat. "Goodbye, Victor. Goodbye, Nate. Take care of that woman. She is worth 10 of me." Nathaniel left the house and rode back to Silverton with the deed in his pocket and the taste of ashes in his mouth. At the boarding house, Clara sat beside Martha's bed and held her bandaged hands while a parade of townspeople came and went. They carried lumber, they carried nails, they carried hammers and saws, and the particular expressions of people who were ashamed of their own silence and determined to make up for it with labor. They were going to rebuild the laundry. Not because Martha had asked. She had not asked for anything. They were rebuilding it because the fire had burned through more than wood and plaster. It had burned through the comfortable numbness that lets decent people live next door to injustice without feeling obligated to do anything about it. And now that the numbness was gone, they could feel again, and what they felt was a need to hammer something. Martha watched them from her bed with an expression that shifted between bewilderment and something that might have been hope. Clara squeezed her hand gently around the bandages. "They are building it back, I can see that. I can see." Martha's voice was rough from the smoke she had inhaled. "Why?" "Because they should have built it sooner. Because you deserved better. Because sometimes people need a fire to remind them that things they take for granted can disappear overnight." That afternoon, Langford's clerk, Peters, arrived at the boarding house with a sealed envelope. Clara took it and opened it. Inside was the land deed, signed in Victor Langford's shaking hand. She read it twice, then brought it to Martha. Martha stared at the deed for a long time. Her burned hands could not hold it, so Clara held it open for her to read. "It is the land," Martha whispered. "Elijah's grave. He gave it back." Clara nodded. He gave it back. Martha closed her eyes and tears ran down her weathered face. She did not make a sound. The tears just came, silent and steady. 5 years of grief and rage and helpless fury flowing out of her like water from a wound that had finally been opened. Clara held her. 2 women in a boarding house room, one with burned hands and one with rope marks on her wrists, holding on to each other while the sound of hammers rang through the walls and the town rebuilt itself around them. 3 weeks later, the world had changed. Territorial marshals had come to Silverton on horseback, grim men in dark coats who asked questions in flat voices and wrote the answers in notebooks. They took statements from Clara, from Martha, from Peters the clerk, from Tommy Hayes, from the 2 men who had dragged Clara to the river and were falling over themselves to cooperate. They examined the ledger copies that Martha had hidden with Reverend Crawford years ago. They matched serial numbers from the Canyon Ridge strong boxes to the robbery reports. Frank Deacon was transferred under guard to the territorial prison at Cannon City. The charge sheet ran 2 pages, and the territorial prosecutor told Sheriff Hayes privately that Deacon would not see the outside of those walls for a very long time. Victor Langford died in his sleep on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after signing the land deed that returned Elijah Dawson's resting place to his widow. The consumption finished what his conscience had started. They buried him in the town cemetery, and Nathaniel was the only person who stood at the graveside, hat in hand, saying goodbye to a man who had been his closest friend and his greatest disappointment. Sheriff Hayes submitted his letter of resignation to the town council on a Wednesday. On Thursday, the town council tore it up and told him to get back to work. It was Tommy who had made the difference. Tommy who had run through the dark to wake his father and drag him to the river and force him to choose between the man Langford's money had made him and the man his son needed him to be. The townspeople figured that any man whose 10-year-old boy had that kind of courage must have something decent buried in him somewhere, and they were willing to let him dig it out. Martha's hands healed slowly. The doctor said she would regain full use of them in time, but the skin would always be scarred, and the fine motor control that had made her stitching nearly invisible would take months to return. She bore this with the same iron composure she bore everything, sitting in her room at the boarding house, watching through the window as the new laundry took shape on the ashes of the old. It was smaller than before, but it was built with good timber and square nails, and the kind of care that comes from people who are trying to apologize with their hands, because their mouths do not know the right words. On a cold Saturday morning at the end of November, Martha Dawson stood in front of her new laundry and looked up at the sign that had been hung above the door. Clara had painted it herself, her letters careful and clear. It read, "Dawson and Morgan, Laundry and Tailoring." Martha looked at the sign, then she looked at Clara. "You put your name up there. You told me once there are 2 kinds of people in this town, people running and people hunting. I am neither. I am staying." Martha made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been a sob, or might have been both at once, and she pulled Clara into a hug with her scarred hands and held on tight. That same morning, 5 miles outside town, Nathaniel Grayson was standing in a room he had not entered in 3 years. The nursery, Anna's nursery. She had spent months preparing it, sewing curtains and knitting blankets and arranging the small wooden animals Nathaniel had carved during the long winter evenings. A rocking chair sat by the window where she had planned to sit and nurse their daughter and watch the mountains turn gold at sunset. Nathaniel stood in the doorway for a long time. Then he walked in. He did not move anything. He did not pack away Anna's curtains or fold up the blankets or take down the wooden animals from the shelf. He just opened the window and let the cold, clean mountain air rush in, filling the room with the smell of pine and snow and the wide open sky. He looked at Anna's wedding dress, still hanging in the wardrobe. White cotton, simple and beautiful, sewn by her own hands. He reached out and touched the fabric, and it was soft under his rough fingers. "You would like her, Anna," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. "She is stubborn. Maybe worse than you, which I did not think was possible. She can shoot better than I can, and she does not scare easy, and she pushed a man down a flight of stairs for putting his hands on her, and I think you would have applauded." He was quiet for a moment. "I am not forgetting you. I could not forget you if I lived 1,000 years. But I think you would tell me that living alone on this ranch until I die is not honoring your memory. It is wasting the life you would have wanted me to live." He closed the window, left the room, closed the door gently behind him. Then he went to the barn and saddled his horse and rode toward town. Clara was sitting on the porch of the new laundry, mending a miner's coat. The November sun was thin but bright, and the air had the clean, sharp bite of coming winter. She had her head bent over her work, her needle moving with the quick, steady rhythm that was as natural to her as breathing, and she did not hear the horse until it stopped in front of her. She looked up. Nathaniel Grayson sat in his saddle, looking down at her. He had shaved. His hair was combed. He was wearing a clean shirt, which Clara had never seen him wear before, and his boots had been polished, which she was fairly certain had never happened in the history of those boots. He dismounted, climbed the porch steps, sat down beside her, not across from her, next to her, both of them facing the street, two people looking in the same direction. The sounds of Silverton filled the silence. A hammer ringing somewhere as the rebuilding continued. Children playing in the street. A dog barking. The ordinary music of a town that had nearly destroyed itself and chosen to rebuild instead. "I brought you something," Nathaniel said. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. Simple paper. Not expensive. The kind you could buy at any general store for 2 cents. He held it out to her, and Clara saw that his hand, the hand that could hold a rifle steady in a blizzard, was shaking. She set down her sewing and took the envelope, opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in handwriting that was rough and uneven, the penmanship of a man who was more comfortable with reins than with a pen. "Dear Miss Morgan," it read, "I am a man of ordinary means and honest work. I own a small horse ranch outside Silverton, Colorado territory. I am no good at talking. I cook worse than any man alive. I still speak to my dead wife when nobody's listening, and I am terrified, more frightened than I have ever been in my life, because I have come to love a woman I do not deserve. But if you are willing to give me a chance, I will spend every day trying to be worthy of it. If you agree, I will be waiting for you on the porch of the laundry on Saturday afternoon. Yours in hope, and this time meaning it, Nathaniel Grayson." I really did write this one myself. Clara read the letter. She read it again. Her hands were trembling, and the paper rustled softly in the mountain air. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her coat pocket, right beside the 11 cents she still carried, not because she needed the money, because those coins were a reminder of who she had been and how far she had come. "Today is Saturday," she said. "I know. You are sitting on the laundry porch, I know." She looked at him. He looked at her. Gray eyes and brown eyes. A man who had convicted himself of cowardice, and a woman who did not know if she was a survivor or a killer. Two broken people sitting on a porch in the thin November sunlight with their wounds showing and their walls down, and nothing between them but the truth. Nathaniel kissed her, not gently, not tentatively. He kissed her the way a man kisses a woman he almost lost to a frozen river in the dark. He kissed her with 3 years of grief breaking open behind it, and something new and terrifying rushing in to fill the space. Clara kissed him back. She kissed him the way a woman kisses when she has finally stopped running. When the ground under her feet feels solid for the first time. When the sound in her head is not the snap of bone on a staircase, but the steady beat of a heart pressed against her own. When they pulled apart, Martha Dawson was standing in the doorway of the laundry with her scarred hands on her hips and an expression of theatrical disapproval on her weathered face. "If you two are going to carry on like that in front of my establishment," she said, "people will think this is a saloon, not a laundry." All three of them laughed. The sound carried down the street where 2 months ago a woman had stepped off a stagecoach with 11 cents in her pocket and a bruise on her face, and not a single soul in the world expecting her. Clara picked up her needle. She looked at the torn coat in her lap, at the thread running between her fingers, at the small, precise stitches that held broken things together. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the violence and the fear, the staircase in Missouri and the river in Silverton, Martha's hands and Nathaniel's letter and the wildflower on her doorstep, and the 11 cents that had been the difference between everything and nothing. She thought about a man who had written her a letter. Not a lie dressed up in someone else's handwriting, but the truth, plain and imperfect and shaking with the effort of saying what needed to be said. She began the next stitch. One stitch. One day. One choice. That was how you mended a life. And that was how you started a new one. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.